Hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us so far. Today we are going to discuss the issue of US-GCC relations, the change and continuity in the Biden administration. We're going to talk about whether the Biden administration has continued the same strategies and policies that the Trump administration was following, and how much this later on, actually, it's going to be 2 days from now. The Biden Middle East trip is going to affect US policies towards the Persian Gulf states. And the importance of this trip to not only the relations and US foreign policy, but also to other ongoing issues such as the JCPOA or the negotiations on the revival of the nuclear deal. We are fortunate to have Mr. Dr. Kamrava with us today. He has joined us from the Doha Institute. He's the professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar, and he's also the director of the Center for International and Regional Studies at School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He has written numerously with regards to the Middle East, specifically the Persian Gulf and Iran. And so we're going to start with his talk and wait for the other comments and Q&A session. Mr. Kamrava, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure being here. I am delighted to once again be collaborating with Iran-Eurica, which is a Center for Real Scholarship and Analysis, and it's an honor to be affiliated here. Just a small correction, if I may. For 2 years now, I have not been the director of the Center for International and Regional Studies, and instead I've been directing the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies at located in Doha. As you mentioned, President Biden will be traveling to Saudi Arabia in order to ostensibly take part in an energy meeting. This is a meeting in which the leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council plus Iraq, Jordan, and the United States will take part. What I will do is first say a couple of things about what the trip means in terms of broader US foreign policy in relation to the Middle East. What are the likely goals and outcomes of Biden's trip, and what ramifications, if any, this is likely to have for the JCPOA. We see in Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia a triumph of realpolitik versus American ideals. The United States has long had a tension in its foreign policy in that American foreign policy is often articulated in using the rhetoric and the discourse of ideals such as human rights, the spread of democracy, self-determination. But then we see that in actual practice, the practice of American foreign policy has been quite realistic and has been directed by realism. The tension between American ideals and American foreign policy is often most acute in democratic administrations. The Republicans actually tend to be more honest with themselves and with their constituents. They are much more concerned about American national interests. And we saw that most bluntly expressed in Trump. Whereas the Democrats, you might say, if you want to be a little less generous, are more hypocritical, because they often talk a good talk in terms of talking about high ideals, but the reality is often quite different. And what we see in Trump's trip, particularly in the op-ed piece that he published 2 days ago, he clearly enunciated that I am going to the Middle East and I will meet with Saudi Arabian leaders because it is in America's national interests. And so we have this justification of America's national interests being quite important. And of course, the two primary American interests that Trump's trip to the Middle East will serve are, first and foremost, strengthening already strong ties with Israel and ensuring that America's relationship with Saudi Arabia returns to the status quo ante. It returns to what is considered to be normal, namely very close relationship between United States and Saudi Arabia. And so what we see is that American ideals of human rights in relation to, for example, Saudi Arabia's human rights record, or the conditions of people in Gaza, or the rule of law when it comes to Israeli settlements, those go all out of the way when it comes to American interests. And these interests include, of course, lower oil prices and ensuring the safety and security of the state of Israel. And in addition to these, what we see is the other dimension of American foreign policy, which is ensuring that there's a regional alliance against Iran. This regional alliance against Iran began to be crystallized during the Trump administration, and the Biden administration is continuing this trend. The continuation of this trend under the Biden administration is somewhat less, the rhetoric is less harsh, but nonetheless, the substance is still the same. So what we see is really not a change in the substance of Biden's foreign policy in the Middle East, as particularly compared to the previous administration. The substance remains the same, although the style is different. The rhetoric is different. The ideals are different. Trump didn't talk about human rights. Biden still at least pays lip service in his op-ed piece in the Washington Post to human rights, but nonetheless, we see that the practice is quite different. So what are the specific goals of Biden's trip to the region and this trip that we see, given that at least the substance of American foreign policy has not necessarily substantively changed? First and foremost, of course, is ensuring that Saudi Arabia and other oil producers pump more gas and produce more gas, and therefore the price of gasoline comes down, particularly in light of the fact that Russia is now out of the Russia is out of the international oil market, at least in terms of in most parts of Europe, and that oil prices are at once again record high. I happen to be joining you this morning from Los Angeles, California, where the United States has some of the highest gas prices. The gas price here, petroleum price here, hovers at around $6 a gallon, and that is a record high. That is in California, which tends to be the highest, but California is a bellwether. And so what we have in the United States is high inflation. Biden's popularity is at record low compared to any other president, most other presidents at this time in their presidency. And so the first goal of his trip really is to make sure that more oil is produced. But then there are a number of other objectives that he hopes to achieve. The other one, of course, the other objective that he hopes to achieve is a normalization, as I mentioned, or a return to the status quo in America's relationship with Saudi Arabia. Up until just a day ago or two, Biden was elusive and evasive as to whether or not he would have a one-on-one relationship with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And now, of course, it has been revealed that indeed his agenda will include a one-on-one relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman, for all intents and purposes, is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. This is a region when we have presidents for life and leaders for life. And so Mohammed bin Salman is likely to be a key player in regional Persian Gulf and Middle East politics for a number of decades to come. And of course, United States wants to make sure that there is a working relationship that is robust and based on a close alliance with Saudi Arabia. The other dimension of the trip, the other part of the trip is meant to reassure American allies that regardless of the outcome of the talks between the United States and Iran, pressure will be continued on Iran, that the United States will not abandon its traditional allies, even though it might strike some sort of a negotiation with Iran. I should add, incidentally, that the primary architect of Biden's Middle East and Persian Gulf policy is a figure in the American National Security Council named Brett McGurk. And Brett McGurk is a veteran of several different administrations. He is extremely friendly towards America's traditional allies in the region, namely Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Israel, and holds strong anti-Iranian views. And with that kind of advice, you can imagine what Biden's agenda during his trip to the region will look like. And of course, the other dimension of the trip, which is key, is the fact that Biden will ensure that the trend toward the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf continues unabated. We know, as we all know, already United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have extremely close relationship with Israel. We know that Israel has placed extrememly sensitive and high-powered radars in UAE in order to keep a watchful eye over Iran and developments, military developments in Iran and in the Persian Gulf. And what Biden is trying to do is to make sure that this trend continues with the likes of Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Last week, it was revealed that Israeli military officials held quote unquote working meetings with Qatari officials. And so already that is on the way. And of course, Biden himself is flying from Tel Aviv to Jeddah, and he's highlighting the symbolic significance of that. We already know that there's a Saudi-Israeli love affair that is blooming, and this is meant to simply reinforce that trend. And so I think overall, Biden's trip does not bode well for Iran. It is really meant to strategically ratchet up the negatives for Iran. And of course, that is something for us to pay close attention to. Finally, what does all of this mean for JCPOA? I am a firm believer in JCPOA. I want the JCPOA to succeed. I want relations to continue to improve. I don't think a regional power like Iran and a superpower like the United States can be at odds, but unfortunately, I'm not optimistic. And the reason I'm not optimistic is because of several reasons. I don't think Biden or the Democrats currently have the political capital to strike any meaningful deal with Iran. They simply don't have the votes. They don't have the political capital, but much more importantly, they don't have the political willpower, with the likes of Brett McGurk calling the shots in, or being the architect of American policy. Robert Malley himself, just a couple of days ago in an interview, said that placed all of the blame on Iran, despite the fact that the Americans will have continued, even during the negotiations, to show bad faith and to impose additional sanctions on Iran. And so I sincerely hope that I'm wrong. I genuinely hope I'm wrong, but my sense is that the nuclear talks will not succeed, and that Biden's trip to the region is yet another indication of this anti-Iran front that has formed across the Middle East, and particularly in the Persian Gulf. I think Iran's alliance with Iraq is already tenuous. Iran's soft power has eroded in Iraq, and I think that alliance is already on shaky grounds. I think our foreign minister, Amir Abdullahian, has done a tremendous job, but in trying to smooth regional relations, but I'm quite frankly not all that optimistic that the JCPOA will succeed in the form that we know it, or we have come to expect. There might be some sort of an agreement at some point, but given regional developments, given domestic political developments in the United States, given the rebellion within the Democratic Party in the Senate, with at least 12 senators having gone, Democratic senators having gone on the record against the JCPOA. My sense is that the United States is not in a position to enter negotiations in good faith. And we've seen already that the European Union doesn't have the courage or the principle to carry through with its own commitments under the rubric of the JCPOA. I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to have a discussion or think through some of these issues with colleagues in Iran and elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kamrava. It was very comprehensive and informative. You mentioned actually, I think, all of the topics that we have discussed prior to the session, and you talked about whether or not there's been a kind of change of policies in the Biden administration. He has continued, of course, with the normalization of relations between Israel and Arab states in the Middle East, as you mentioned, and of course, some aspects of his policies have changed, or he has tried to change them. His efforts about reviving the JCPOA and the goals and the likely outcomes of this trip in particular. I would like to ask a question before my colleagues pose their questions. As you mentioned in your talk, at the beginning of your talk, that the main goal, or the first, let's say, motivation for this trip is creating a balance in the global energy market, which is, of course, the result of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Could we also consider other aspects of this conflict affecting U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East? For example, the issue of deterrence, specifically nuclear deterrence. How much do you think the Russia-Ukraine war has affected not only U.S. but also Europe's view of deterrence? And would that change of outlook create a new understanding of how the other players and actors in the Middle East, whether, for example, countries like Saudi Arabia, who have long pursued the goal of becoming nuclear states, would they be allowed to join this club of nuclear states, or would there be renewed intentions of creating other military or security alliances to create a kind of deterrence against their perception of enemy, Russia, China, Iran, of course, forming new coalitions against these countries?
Thank you. That's a really good question, and I think it's a question we're all trying to figure out. My sense is that the United States is much more concerned about some of the states that have not rushed to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For example, Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, and Turkey. And I think what the US is, and the European Union, what they're concerned about is ensuring that we're not entering a new bipolar era in which we have the United States and European Union and some of their allies on one side, and Russia, China, Iran, and a number of other countries, India and others on the other side. And so I don't think this would have any consequence for nuclear proliferation. Of course, the desire to prevent nuclear proliferation will continue. The desire to stop nuclear proliferation will continue. But I think the assumption is that let's isolate Russia and its allies to the fullest extent possible. And if Iran is an ally of Russia, or if China, let's make sure that China is not, doesn't become a full ally of Russia, and that we're not entering a new bipolar global security architecture. I think that's the primary goal, and one of the goals of the Biden administration. I think the bigger eye that the US has is on Turkey, but also, of course, on Saudi Arabia. The assumption, you know, that Saudi Arabia and Russia have had very close relations, and this is this is also not insignificant in Biden's desire to travel to Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Actually, you responded to my question, but because it's part of the bigger context of creating a new air missile system, which is, let's say, consistent in the whole region, and trying to connect all the Arab states, Israel, with the same, supporting them with some kind of conclusive or inclusive, let's say, security structure. And of course, it comes from the background of US policies that we saw with regards to Afghanistan. Some interpreted it as a kind of withdrawal from the region, or reducing presence and or creating a kind of indirect leadership in the region, leaving the Middle East states and actors to create balance and balance of power themselves. So my question was not about, of course, specifically, it's not a, they don't have intentions to create that bipolar or intensify that the conflicts in the region, but of course, a kind of continuation of US policy from the beginning of Biden's administration, reducing the costs of being present in the Middle East to a more, let's say, revised outlook towards the role of the Middle East states.
Yes, that actually is quite accurate. There has long been a debate in the United States among American policy circles that, look, the states of the Persian Gulf are buying millions and millions of dollars worth of US weaponry, hundreds of millions of dollars. And then at the same time, they rely on the United States to provide their security. And again, American officials who come to regional capitals like Doha and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh tell local officials, look, use your American-made weaponry against Iran. Don't be so reliant on the United States. Continue buying American weaponry, but make sure you use it. And for the longest time, the United States has been, the regional leaders have been extremely psychologically dependent on the United States for their security provision, for provision of their security needs. What has happened now in the Persian Gulf, in the states of the Persian Gulf, there's been a leadership change, and a new generation of leaders are much more willing to rely on their own purchases and act as more independent actors as compared to the previous generation. And we see this particularly in Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, who have been much more eager to make policies and then explain it to the United States later, or deal with the United States later, rather than right there and then.
We are happy that you could join us.
Thank you.
And I would just give you a brief overview of what we've talked so far, and then give you the floors. Dr. Kamrava just explained the goals, the main goals and intentions of Biden's trip to the Middle East. And he explained that how much Biden's policies towards the Persian Gulf states and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf has changed, or can be seen a kind of continuation of Trump's administration policies, mainly with regards to the normalization of Arab-Israeli relations. And he also mentioned the goal of creating a kind of balance, reducing the price of energy, which has happened as an ensuing consequence of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And also, he mentioned that the US wants to reassure its Middle East allies or the Persian Gulf allies of the fact that whether or not the negotiations on the revival of JCPOA are successful, the US is still going to keep its support, the security support of them. And he also explained his own predictions about the likely outcomes of the negotiations, whether or not the Democrats have enough votes and support domestically to be able to strike this deal, the renewed deal, and also trying to create a kind of connection between Saudi Arabia and Israel, as some are predicting that there's so much speculation about the likely outcome of this trip would be helping the two countries to be closer. As of course we've seen that the only major Arab state in the Persian Gulf who has not joined this normalization of relations is Saudi Arabia, and if it joins, it's going to be a big step in this whole process. So I will not talk anymore and give you the floor, and after your talk, we will discuss more facts.
Well, thank you so much. I think the so-called Abraham Accords is a wonderful place to begin. As we all know, there has been a significant amount of continuity from the Trump presidency into the policies of President Joe Biden's administration, and these US-backed efforts to expand the Abraham Accords and bring some more countries into these diplomatic deals that normalize Arab states' relations with Israel at the expense of the Palestinian struggle is definitely a case in point. When it comes to the Saudi-Israeli relationship, however, I don't believe the Biden administration will successfully bring the Saudi kingdom into the Abraham Accords. I think that this is especially the case with King Salman still being on the throne. I think considering the generation of Saudis that he comes from, and also the fact that the Palestinian cause has been important to King Salman for so many decades, gives us reason to think that if Saudi Arabia were to later join the Abraham Accords, this would only be after Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman becomes the king of Saudi Arabia. But even after the Crown Prince becomes the official ruler of Saudi Arabia, I'm still not convinced that the Biden administration or any future American administration will be able to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia is so different from the UAE in many ways. There could be a real conservative backlash from within the society that could make it very risky for Riyadh to officially normalize diplomatic relations with Israel in an official capacity. Also, unlike the UAE, Saudi Arabia, where the king ever since the 1980s has had the official title custodian of the two holy mosques, has a certain role in the wider Arab and Islamic world that has to be considered too. Now, having said all of that, there is no doubt that Saudi Arabia and Israel have an unofficial relationship. This is perhaps the Middle East's worst kept secret, and it has been the worst kept secret in the region for decades. And to the point, I think Saudi Arabia is going to take some mini steps toward normalization that do come short of an official entry into the Abraham Accords, but do contribute to this wider Arab trend toward normalization. I think we could see the Biden administration later this month, when the US president is in Jeddah, talk about some of the steps, the mini steps that Saudi Arabia could make toward having some sort of an unofficially normalized relationship with Israel. I think there is good reason to expect Israeli companies to start playing more of a role in the Saudi economy, particularly with respect to Vision 2030. And just as Netanyahu came to the futuristic city of Neom in, if I remember correctly, that was November 2020, we could see some more of these high-profile visits. We could see the Saudis opening their airspace to the Israelis to make it easier for Israel to deepen its contacts with the UAE and Bahrain, which also well, that was the second Arab country to normalize with Israel, following in Abu Dhabi's footsteps. But to go a little bit beyond Saudi Arabia, I think the Biden administration is going to see that there is a backlash to the Abraham Accords, and you're seeing some Arab states such as Iraq, Kuwait, and Algeria come out more vocally opposed to normalization. These positions are not new. Those three Arab states that I just mentioned have long been opposed to normalizing relations with Israel before the end of the occupation of land which the Israelis annexed in 1967. But nonetheless, the Abraham Accords are serving to put pressure on the Arab states in the anti-normalization camp to become more vocal. And I think at a time when the Biden administration is so concerned about Israel's integration into the wider Arab region, that's going to be a point that officials in Biden's team should certainly consider.
Thank you. You mentioned about, you talked about the normalization or the Abraham Accords, which is a key aspect of this trip. We've also talked about this in depth with Dr. Kamrava, but also many analysts refer to other goals of this trip, such as with regards to the energy prices and the global energy market, and also the issue of the Iran nuclear negotiations. I asked Dr. Kamrava whether he thinks this trip is going to be a continuation of the process that the US has started from the beginning of the Biden administration. With regards to Afghanistan, we witnessed US having less, let's say, or a new sort of presence in the region, putting the costs on the shoulder of the Middle East states, and having an indirect, let's say, leadership there, and also trying to create a kind of cohesion among these states against its perceived threats from Russia, China, and of course Iran. So don't you think that it's going to, what do you think, how much is going to affect the negotiations, especially with Biden's visit to Tel Aviv, and how will the result of course, negotiations be connected with this trip?
Well, unfortunately, and I say this as someone who has always been a huge proponent of the JCPOA, unfortunately, it appears that the nuclear negotiations are likely to collapse in acrimony. I have a very pessimistic outlook toward this question of whether or not a JCPOA revival is possible. And that is certainly the fault of the Trump administration, which thought it was a good idea to unilaterally pull the US out of the deal in May 2018, but it's also the fault of the Biden administration for not making good on Biden's campaign pledge to bring the US back into the JCPOA. But I think your question is aimed at looking forward, not going through the past that everyone here knows so well. So within this context of the Middle East and by extension, the whole world preparing for a post-JCPOA future, there is a lot of uncertainty. And the Arab states in the Persian Gulf are wondering what will be the regional ramifications of these nuclear negotiations falling apart without a revival of the nuclear accord. I think that one of Biden's objectives on this upcoming trip to Jeddah is to discuss Iran-related issues with Washington's allies and partners in the Arab region being obviously the six GCC states, in addition to Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. I think what the Saudi leadership wants from the Biden administration are a whole set of assurances related to security and assurances related to Saudi Arabia's perception of what the kingdom sees as a big threat from Iran. However, in my personal opinion, the Biden administration will have a very difficult time convincing the Saudis that they should feel any sense of confidence in the United States. This has to do with a number of issues, including the one that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which was the humiliating US withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, just almost 1 year ago. That episode, plus a number of other events in recent years, not just during Biden's presidency, but also during the Trump and Obama eras as well, have led to the Saudis being much less confident in the US as the kingdom's security guarantor. And we could certainly say that about other Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf, including the United Arab Emirates and also the Kingdom of Bahrain. There's very little trust that the government of Saudi Arabia has in the Biden administration. And I think that that is definitely a dynamic which has resulted in the Saudi leadership determining that it is wise to engage the Iranians in greater dialogue. And as we saw beginning in April 2021, these direct talks opened between the Saudis and Iranians in Baghdad. And I think that was a very healthy development for the Middle East. And that might be one of the positive outcomes resulting from Arab states preparing for a more multipolar future, and a future in which they might not have foreign policies related to Iran that are so tied to the heavy US presence in the region. However, there's no doubt that the Israel factor is important too. And if the Israelis are to increase their aggression against Iran and Iranian interests in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, there could be a major escalation, and the brinkmanship between Israel and Iran could spiral out of control in certain ways that would leave the Arab states of the Persian Gulf very vulnerable. And I have to imagine that when Biden is in Jeddah later this month, these kinds of scenarios are going to be at the heart of many of the discussions taking place.
Yes, I agree with the points you've mentioned, and I think Dr. Kamrava is actually agreed with one of your points about the multipolar future, and also more independent policymaking on the side of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. There's a question from our audience, from the participants, which I'm going to ask both of you, which is related to our discussion. One of our participants has asked, some analysts refer to Iran as a main reluctant state for reestablishing relations with the US, but do you think Washington is ready to have a constructive and sustainable relation with Tehran, irrespective of some opponents, and considering the fact that the White House does not recognize Iran's interests in the region? Whoever who would like to respond to this question, yes.
Let me take a shot at it. The simple answer is no. Giorgio, I think you're in Washington, so you might be closer to the policy pulse of what's going on. But my sense is that the United States is not willing to establish relations with Iran for the time being for several reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, the political costs are too much. I know that the United States officially wants to engage in or has sanctions as a tool for changing behavior. But really, if you listen very closely and to American policymakers, I think they find the system in Iran fundamentally at odds with the United States. And so at least the Trump administration openly called for regime change rather than a change in behavior. And so I can't imagine the United States or any White House having the political will to establish normal relations with Iran. Even the discussions that are going on, the nuclear negotiations, in the same way that there are hardliners in Tehran that condemn the negotiations, there are hardliners in the United States that are extremely powerful in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. And they put pressure on the White House. And as I mentioned with National Security Council, within the institutions of the United States, the policymaking institutions, whether it's in the State Department or National Security Council, I don't think there is anyone who thinks that it would be to the US's advantage to establish relations with Iran.
Giorgio, what do you think? Do you have any comments about that?
I agree. I think that had the US stayed in the JCPOA or had Biden brought the US back into the nuclear deal, there would have at least been an opportunity not for the US and Iran to have a particularly positive or a warm relationship, but to at least have a relationship that could become a little bit more stable, and perhaps gradually over time, the bilateral relationship would have had the potential to improve. But as long as the US is not in the JCPOA and is imposing these strangling sanctions on Iran, I'm not able to see any improvements in the relationship. I think the question becomes whether the tensions would greatly exacerbate or sort of stay at the level they are. But again, I unfortunately would have to assume that there's no hope for any real improvements in the relationship under current circumstances. I also think that the US and Iran have so many different and clashing interests throughout the wider Middle East, whether we're talking about the situation in Syria with President Bashar al-Assad staying in power, the situation in Lebanon or Iraq. There are just so many issues in the region that matter a lot to Washington and Tehran, in which these two powers, US and Iran, are just completely opposing stakeholders. It's just very difficult for me to see any improvements in this bilateral relationship.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. There's another question from my colleagues at the Institute about the role of energy security in creating a regional order and also in the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab countries. How much do you think this energy security factor is going to play a role?
Giorgio, I think that's you.
Oh, excuse me. So sorry.
No, I think that's your expertise.
Oh, I don't know if I'm better qualified to answer this question than you are, but I would say that despite the fact that many analysts overlook this issue, energy has been one of the dimensions to the Abraham Accords, with there being some talk, at least in 2020, about the UAE providing Israel with oil, and this was about trying to make Israel less dependent on northern Iraq for its energy requirements. I certainly don't think that was the motivating factor behind the normalization of relations between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv, but that was, certainly a factor in play.
So you see more motivation with regards to creating order and reducing tensions.
Yeah, in general, as we were saying earlier, there is a perception among US allies and partners in the region, or at least many of them, and this certainly includes the UAE and Israel, that the US is withdrawing from the Middle East. Whether or not that's a reality is perhaps a topic for a whole separate discussion, but there's no debate about the fact that countries in the region do have that perception, and there's no denying that they are making foreign policy decisions based on the assumption that that is a reality. And I think this normalization between UAE and Israel, and between Bahrain and Israel, is about trying to establish a new security axis in the Middle East that is more independent from the United States, and is about preparing for a future security landscape whereby these countries might not be able to depend on Washington as they did for so many years, for so many decades. And this has to do with many of the shared ideas and shared threat perceptions on the part of Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv. Many of the actors in the region whose conduct concerns Abu Dhabi also concern Israel. These two countries have many ideational synergies. They both stand strongly against democratization in the Arab world. They were both terrified by the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011. They're frankly terrified by the expansion of Iran's influence throughout the Arab world. And I think these are really the main dynamics from geopolitical and security standpoints that brought the UAE and Israel together, and could possibly bring some other Arab states closer to Israel in the months and the years ahead. As I said, this is really about preparing for a new order in the Middle East, whereby the US is going to be not gone from the region, but less and less influential in the region.
Thank you. Dr. Hadian from the US program of our institute has raised his hand, and I'm going to ask him to talk about his question. Dr. Hadian, Mr. Hadian, can you hear us? I think he's not yet connected. Okay, team gets access. Of course, I've given him access to microphone and video. We have another person who has raised their hand. Okay, Mr. Kamrava.
Hello. I hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, both from you, the host, and also our guest speakers for sharing their thoughts and ideas with us. My question is regarding both the US and UK foreign policy in the region. First, I want to ask this question. Considering the fact that UK is, the better say, was reshaping relations with GCC states, and by opening its military base, reopening it in Bahrain, how much do you think this could be the revival of her traditional role in the region? And how much do you think it could be traced back to the US paved the way for other world powers playing the role in the region, this issue? Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, Mr. Kamrava or Cafiero, anyone would like to respond to that?
Sure. There is definitely, as we've been discussing, a decline of US influence in the Persian Gulf and the greater Middle East that has led to some vacuums opening up, some voids. And not only are America's geopolitical rivals trying to fill those voids, but we've also seen some countries in NATO trying to fill those voids. The three that really come to mind are Turkey, France, and the UK. I'm very grateful for the question. I think it raises some important issues. I do interpret the reopening of the British military base in Bahrain as part of London's efforts to possibly take advantage of an opportunity that stems from GCC countries' efforts to further diversify their relations away from the United States. But at the same time, my personal view is that the UK has a foreign policy that's very tied to US foreign policy. I would not expect London to ever pursue an agenda in the Middle East that clashed with the agenda of the United States. My view is that the UK is very much a junior partner when it comes to its extremely close alliance with the United States. And I do not think England's plan to come back east of Suez is going to necessarily be a huge game changer in the Middle East. I do not think that there is going to be a future anytime soon in which the UK is capable of coming close to competing with the US for influence in the Persian Gulf. I think those days ended decades ago, and I don't expect us to return to those days anytime soon.
Yes, absolutely.
If I may just add to that,
Yes,
I completely agree with what Giorgio just said. And I want to emphasize his mention of diversifying the security providers. And we saw this particularly in relation to Qatar, for example, that recently has been purchasing armaments from not just the United States, but also from other Western arms providers. And this isn't necessarily, as Giorgio mentioned, to supplant or replace the United States, but to deepen the security arrangements that these countries have with the Western allies. And many of these military arrangements are long-term. And so in the long term, they want to diversify the security providers. Qatar recently bought some boats, some naval equipment from Italy. Again, in an attempt over the long run to ensure that they have some sort of, not necessarily replacements, but suppliers that complement their basically American supplied military structure.
Yes, thank you. And of course, considering the fact that the future of UK's Prime Minister is not yet clear, and we don't know which party is going to lead the next general election. So that will be ambiguous. Continue to be a kind of, as you mentioned, playing the junior role and having tight foreign policy in the US. So Mr. Hadian has been able to join us, and he's going to just ask his question. Let's go ahead.
Thank you for the informative presentations. I wanted to ask that since Russia is expanding its operations in the Donbass and is considering acquiring more territory beyond Donbass in Ukraine, how does this affect the Iranian nuclear negotiations? Because if a deal is sealed right now, it wouldn't be in Russian interests. But since perhaps the Russians are considering acquiring more territory by autumn or winter, and even another assault on Kiev, how would this affect the nuclear negotiations if the Russians expand their operations in Ukraine?
I'll have a go at this because I'm eager to hear what Giorgio has to say. The simple question is, I don't know. But let me say this. The European Union right now has a number of concerns. And for the longer that the Russian operation or the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, and the more that Ukraine loses territory, the more Europe's attention will be diverted. And that could be good or bad for the JCPOA, because on the one hand, the Americans might want to come up with some sort of a quick agreement or kind of some sort of conclusion so that they can divert their full resources elsewhere. Unfortunately, I think that's too optimistic of a scenario insofar as the JCPOA is concerned. My sense is that as the war in Ukraine continues longer, Europe's attention will be even more diverted, and the negotiations with Iran will go further and further down the line. Historically, Europe has or historically meaning for the last 5 years or so, Europe has had to deal with Putin, Brexit, first Trump, and now we can say the US has once again rejoined the European alliance. But for Europeans, the nuclear negotiations have not been necessarily as high on their agenda as they have been for Iran. And I think with the Russian invasion, I think that the urgency that nuclear negotiations might have had has moved even further down the list of priorities that Europe might have.
Professor, I would like to emphasize that I know that since the war is dragging on, and as we get closer to winter, energy becomes a vital point in this conflict. And if Russia supposedly decides to seize more Ukrainian territory, more than the Donbass, in order to gain leverage against Europe, it would cut gas and oil supplies in the winter. But furthermore, it would like to avoid an Iranian entry into the oil and gas market by winter. I wanted you to provide an opinion on what the Russian position on the revival of JCPOA would be under such circumstances.
Excellent question. I don't think the Russians are keen to see the JCPOA succeed. I think in Iran, I think the Iranian team has probably put too much hope that Russia and China are on board, they pay lip service, but I don't think there's the eagerness that we think. And precisely for the reasons that you just mentioned, I don't think Russia is keen either. Of course, for its own reasons, because of Iran's entry into the oil market, because it wants to see continuation of tensions between Iran and the United States, and wants to make sure that Iran remains as close to Russia theoretically as it has been up until now. So I don't think the Russians are keen either, for different reasons, for the JCPOA to succeed. Again, I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but that's my read.
And I have a second question as well. May I ask that too?
Just wait for a moment. Let's see if Giorgio has any comments on the first question.
Yes, when the Russian-Ukrainian war erupted in February, at that time, I thought that that would result in the Biden administration having greater incentive to sort of loosen its positioning vis-a-vis the JCPOA negotiations, and to try to see to it that there could be an acceleration toward a revival of the JCPOA. It was clear that at that point, the conflict in Eastern Europe was going to become the administration's #1 concern, and it would make sense to close the JCPOA issue and sort of resolve that crisis so that the US could focus on Ukraine and not worry about 2 international crises happening simultaneously. Then there was, of course, the issue of how they could benefit the US and countries in Europe if Iranian oil would come back in the market. However, it's been very clear that that has not been the logic accepted by the Biden administration. I do not think that events in Ukraine this year have prompted the Biden administration to approach the JCPOA talks any differently. Something which irritates me a little bit being here in Washington has to do with the way in which these 2 issues are connected among many foreign policy pundits and politicians here in Washington. There is this view that because Russia has been an interlocutor between the US and Iran at certain points throughout the JCPOA talks, that going ahead with the JCPOA would constitute some sort of a capitulation to Russia. My personal view is that that is absurd, but you will hear many people in Washington frame the issue that way. I completely agree with this assessment that Russia does not want to see the JCPOA revived. Yes, Moscow's official position is in favor of reconstituting the nuclear deal, but if the JCPOA is to be revived, you could see some economic, diplomatic relations opening up between Iran and Western countries that would serve to weaken the leverage that Russia has in its relationship with Iran, and it would serve Russia's own narrow interests for Iran to continue to be on very negative terms with the US and other Western countries. So that's how I look at it. But again, I don't think that anything going on in relation to the Russian-Ukrainian war should make us any more optimistic about the Biden administration taking the steps that it would need to take in order for the JCPOA to be reconstituted in some sort of an effective or a timely manner.
I think that completes the response to your question, Mr. Hartley. Would you like to pose your second question?
I would be thankful if I would be allowed to do so. Well, My second question is about the situation in Syria, that since Russia is heavily engaged with the conflict in Ukraine, and Russian presence in Syria is decreasing in a way or another, how would this affect Syria's position within the Arab world, and also its relations with Iran? Because we've noticed some efforts to bring back Syria into the Arab sphere, and also the Israelis are using coercive diplomacy by bombing the Damascus airport and so on and so forth in order to bring back Syria into the Arab sphere. I would like to know, how do you see the perspective for Syria?
Okay, I'll take the first shot at this question. Well, the Arab states, really led in this case by the UAE, that have been trying to bring Syria back into the Arab region's diplomatic fold, have looked at the, if you will, sort of competition between Russia and Iran for influence in Syria, and they've wanted to see Russia be the dominant ally of the Syrian government, playing the biggest role as the protector of Assad's government. And it's very clear that the UAE, really going back a number of years, I would argue going back to 2015, when the Russians began to intensify their direct military intervention, they were very comfortable with what Russia was doing in the UAE. The UAE's leadership was very comfortable with what Russia was doing in Syria. Their problem was not with Assad being the leader of Syria, say. Their concern was about the extent to which Assad had allied his country so closely with Iran, and they wanted to see Syria become much more in Russia's orbit at the expense of Iran's orbit. So therefore, now, as the conflict in Ukraine is requiring Russia to not abandon Syria at all, but to lighten its footprint in Syria and to pass, if you will, pass over control of certain military bases in Syria to the Iranians, a concern in some of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf is that the Ukraine conflict is going to result in Iran becoming a more powerful actor inside Syria. This is also true with respect to Israel. Israel was always very comfortable with what Russia was doing inside Syria. I would go as far as saying Israel has very much welcomed the Russian role in Syria. What has made Israel nervous is the role that Iran has been playing inside Syria. Therefore, it's also true for Tel Aviv that this sort of shift in which Russia is becoming less focused and less committed to Syria, and Iran is filling some of those gaps. Those developments constitute very serious concerns for some GCC countries as well as Israel.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kamrava, would you like to add any comments about this question?
Thank you. I think that that answer was very thorough, and I completely agree with it. I don't have anything to add.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mehran, first, Giorgio joined us. I was not able to introduce myself. Dr. Kamrava we've had another session before. We've been fortunate to have him in our previous sessions. But I'm the research director, not Ms. Mehran. I just wanted to make that clear. but she has asked a question in the comments about, just read through it. One of the main topics of discussions between President Biden and his regional counterparts is about integrated air defense system. While there is a growing bipartisan consensus inside the US over this plan, what is European countries' approach, and would they contribute tangible support to the integrated air defense system in the Middle East? So that was from our colleague from the US program.
I would say about this whole discussion of a so-called Arab NATO, I think that this is unrealistic. This is an idea that is not new. When we go back to the Trump presidency was when we started to see the United States pushing for this idea. I thought it was unrealistic at the time, and it did not develop for a number of reasons. Those factors are still in play, and therefore I don't think today it's any more likely to turn into a real alliance. I think it's going to remain just a concept on paper. This has to do with a few factors. Logistically speaking, it would be difficult for the 6 GCC states, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel to integrate their militaries in sort of a NATO-like manner, but also politically, some of these countries in the GCC, such as Kuwait and Oman, would never want to cooperate militarily with Israel in such an overt manner. They are opposed to normalization. The Palestinian issue matters a lot to people in their governments, people in their societies, and to be part of some Middle Eastern military alliance where presumably the Israelis play a leading role is something they would not want to sign up for. Additionally, this is especially the case for the Sultanate of Oman. Ever since Iran's 1979 revolution, Oman has been one country in the GCC that's been the most sensitive to Iran's security concerns. Oman has historically avoided joining initiatives in the region that result in Iran feeling more vulnerable or feeling more threatened. And just last month, the Sultan of Oman came out and said, our country is not going to join some alliance that's aimed at weakening Iran. Also, when you look at the relationship between Qatar and Iran, it's a very pragmatic relationship in which the two countries seem to have a lot of respect for the security concerns of the other. So I also would not have an easy time imagining Qatar entering some sort of Arab NATO. This question about the European angle, I have not heard anything about what potential role the Europeans would play in the so-called Arab NATO. But as I said, I think Arab NATO is going to be something on a piece of paper and no place else. So I would say I don't really think there's a role for European countries or really any country to play in an alliance if it's never going to actually become an alliance in practice.
Yes. I think she mentioned the Europe's role because of European Union's emphasis on playing a more proactive role in the Middle East. Perhaps she was referring to that to see whether you would just somehow coordinate with the US in this regard.
I think certain European countries would like to deepen their relationships with GCC states in this new environment whereby there's greater east-west bifurcation, and European countries are trying to end their addiction to Russian gas and oil. They're looking to countries in the Persian Gulf, such as Qatar and UAE, to try to gain access to energy from countries that are not Russia. I think there's a desire in some European Union countries and members of the GCC to deepen investment and trade relations, but I do not see either the European Union as a bloc or individual countries inside the European Union becoming so important to GCC countries' defense at the expense of the US role in this part of the Middle East. I don't think that countries in the GCC really believe that European powers are, mostly with them so focused on what's going on in Ukraine, I don't think they're expecting European powers to start playing an ambitious role in terms of the Persian Gulf's security landscape, at least at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Mr. Kamrava, would you like to add any points or comments?
Just very quickly, I agree with everything Giorgio just said. My only addition would be that let's not forget the so-called GCC crisis from 2017 to 2020 and the deep wound that that rift has left behind and the tremendous mistrust that exists among these actors, particularly when it comes to Qatar. So as Giorgio mentioned, when it comes to the so-called Arab NATO, I can't imagine things like common command and control structure, integration of militaries, sharing of military information that would verge on kind of classified and secret information. And so while we are likely to continue to see lip service and the issuing of resolutions every time GCC heads of state meet, when it comes to concrete steps like creating kind of unified military command, I think even at a political level within each of these countries, that is not likely to happen. Let's not forget that the GCC within itself has serious disagreements and areas of tensions that are subject to ebbs and flows. Excuse me. And the kind of close friendship that we see between UAE and Saudi Arabia itself is likely to come under strain when some of the common threats are either lessened or removed. And so, as Giorgio just mentioned, I can't imagine a unified military command of some kind, even under an American umbrella or American auspices, forming to counter Iran, in addition to all the other reasons we heard.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you to both of you who made it to this session. Of course, I understand the time gaps, and it must have been difficult at this time at night in Washington and in Los Angeles. And I really appreciate it, that your comments, your talks, and the fact that you took the time. Hope to see you again in other sessions, and have a great night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.